And I may even ask you, Mark, at some point to be my cameraman and have you pan in on my diagram, so we may actually have some live action movement here tonight. Okay, let's roll them. Are we rolling?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So we're on DAF Nun Vav Amud Aleph, and we were learning yesterday some Agadita regarding the importance of not eating your vegetables. But let's go on to the next piece of Agadita. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. It's about the 7th or 8th line. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Kol ir sheyesh ba malos umordos adamu vehema shaba mesim b'chatzi yameim. That if any city or town that has a lot of slopes going up and down, steep movement up and down, people and animals die midway through their life. They don't live out the full lifespan. So the Gemara says, "Mesim sal kadaita." How can you say such a thing? How can you say people die in the middle of a life if they live in a hilly town? We see people do live long lives. Ella ema maskina b'chatzi yameim. But rather, what it means is that they develop symptoms of old age in the middle of their life, because the joints start to creak, and you need knee replacements and hip replacements and things like that, because you're constantly you're overworking them. I was in Sfas for Shabbos a few months ago, and I said to myself, and I see this alter Yid walking up and down the hills of Sfas. I says, how does this guy do it? I said, I'm barely going up and down these very steep hills. And people live here every day. They walk to the Makolet.
Like Yerushalayim?
And Yerushalayim is not as bad as Tzfat. Yerushalayim can be pretty hilly too. But the thing is that we have to appreciate Thorn Hill, nice and flat, farmland. It's a machaya to walk here.
I would have thought this would have given people. I would have thought this building their exercise, they would be more fit as time goes on.
Good shape that way too.
They're in good shape. Rather than getting them in good shape, not straining them.
Yeah, but
they look like they're worn out the joints, but they'll live a long time because the cardiovascular system is good.
That's right. They'll live a long life, but they
won't be walking.
In misery. They'll need hip and knee replacements.
Maybe head replacements. They don't exercise.
What?
Maybe head replacements.
Yeah. All right. Amar Rav Huna berei the Rav Yehoshua Hani Mulyasa the Beibiri the Veinarash Azkenon. He says those slopes of the towns of Biri and Narash were what caused me to become elderly and stooped over before my time. Tana Rabbana. So now let's go back to the halacha. Ba l'rabba amirabba abiribua olam. So when you want to square off a town for the purpose of creating the tchum, we said you square it off, but you square it off according to the directions of due north, south, east, and west. So the four sides of your square, the top side of the square is facing due north, the bottom side of the square is facing due south, east, and west. Perfect. We've learned this before. We know this. But now we're going to get into the astronomy of it, because how do you calculate what is due north and due south? You don't have a compass, right? Because this is before the age of compasses. So what are you going to do? So the Gemara now says, so tzfona litzfon olam, drum lidrum olam, north is facing due north, south is facing due south. The simaneich egla batzafon va'akrav bedarim. The way to know this, if you want to calculate it using astronomy, is you look for the constellation of Egla, which usually I think that's Taurus, is how you would translate it, and Akrav, which would be Scorpio, look for that in the south. So at night you can tell what is due north, I guess in Bavel, where this is being written, by looking for Taurus, the Taurus constellation, and due south you'll be able to find by the Scorpio.
Does it matter which season though?
I would think it would matter which season. Again, this is not my bag, man, and so I don't know. It's just.
How did they know that to begin? How did they know such a thing? The north is.
Well, it is quite remarkable that Chazal possessed a lot of knowledge of astronomy and navigation and geometry and astronomy. I don't want to get into too speculative here and too off the page, but there's a lot of discussion whether Chazal had this as a Masorah from Har Sinai or whether they borrowed this from.
Didn't they know where the sun rose in the morning?
Galilee would not live for a long time, but No, the Babylonians had a tremendous knowledge of astronomy. The Babylonians, ancient Babylonia had tremendous knowledge, and the Greeks also.
And they know where the sun rose in the morning, though. So they knew where that.
Wait.
Sorry.
We're going to get there. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Imeinu Yodea l'Rabba'a b'Ribu'a shel Olam miRabba'a kimin ha'tekufa. So now Rabbi Yossi says, look, if you can't tell what is due north and south, you don't need to use the stars as your guide. Here's another way of calculating. Use the tekufos. Now, what are tekufos? There are 4 tekufos over the course of the year. We know them as the equinoxes and the solstices. There are 4. Imagine a year has 4 quadrants. There are 4 quarters of the year: winter, spring, summer, or fall. The first day of spring we know as the spring equinox. The first day of summer we call the summer solstice, and so those have terms in Talmudic language. The first day of spring is called Tekufas Nisan. The first day, because it's in the month of Nisan, the solstice of Tammuz, the solstice of the summer is called Tekufas Tammuz. It's the hottest day or the longest day of the year. The fall equinox is known as Tekufas Tishrei, and the winter solstice is known as Tekufas Teves. So you've got Tekufas Nisan, Tekufas Tammuz, Tekufas Tishrei, and Tekufas Teves. Okay, so use the quadrants, use the Tekufos to be your guide. Ketzah. So how does that work? Chama yotze b'yom aroch v'shokas b'yom aroch zehu p'nei tzafon. He says, take a look where the sun is rising and setting during the longest day of the year, which would be Tekufas Tammuz, which would be the summer solstice. And because of the positioning of the sun on the longest day of the year, it's going to be the northernmost point. So it'll rise in the northeast, it'll set in the northwest. Use sort of that as your guide to tell you, well, it's all the way over there, from east to west. That will be my calculus for how I get to due north. By looking at where it rises and looking at where it sets, sort of looking at that plane in the horizon between those 2 points, and that'll be how I calculate what is due north. And furthermore, he says, Chama yotze b'yom katzar, v'shokas b'yom katzar, zehu p'nei darom. When the sun rises on the shortest day of the year and sets on the shortest day of the year, it's going to come up in the southeast corner of the horizon and set in the southwest corner of the horizon. That's the way you'll be able to calculate where south is. Now, as you'll see in just a moment, it doesn't really work that way. It really depends. This would only work if you're at the equator, because if you're in the northern hemisphere, you'll never see the sun in the southern part of the sky, because you're in the north. So hold on to that idea for a minute. Tekufas Nisan and Tekufas Tishrei, Chama yotze b'chatzi mizrach v'shokas b'chatzi marav. And during the equinox days, which is Tekufas Nisan and Tekufas Tishrei, the sun rises exactly in the middle of the sky in the east and sets in the middle of the sky in the west, which is also not completely accurate, because if you're in the northern hemisphere, it's not going to be that way. Shenamar, as it says, Holech el darom v'sovev el tzafon, Holech el darom biyom v'sovev el tzafon balayla. So what does it mean, Holech el darom? The sun travels. Holech is the verb that is being used to describe the sun as it's on its trajectory from east to west during the daytime. And sovev is the trajectory of the sun at nighttime when it is going from west to east. So what the pasuk is describing in Koheles is that the sun comes from the north and moves in a southerly direction as it's moving from the north, and then curves back out towards the north when it sets, and or at least it has the appearance of doing that. The sovev el tzafon, and then when it comes back, when it comes at night, when it comes back, it moves back towards the north. Holech el darom bayom v'sovev el tzafon balayla. And then it says, Sovev, Sovev, Holech haruach. It goes around, does the wind. Elu p'nei mizrach u'p'nei ma'arav. This refers to the entire face of the east and the entire face of the west. Shapamim mahalachasan upa'amim misavivasan. That sometimes the sun moves during the daytime, and sometimes it goes around at nighttime. And there are a number of different ways to understand this. Rashi has the medieval concept of the trajectory of the sun, which we know today is not accurate. Rashi was under the impression, as were many medievalists, that there is an opaque dome that covers the entire planet Earth, and that the sun at night, and that the Earth presumably is flat, the sun at night, where does it go? So Chazal say that the sun at night, it goes from east to west during the daytime, and then it goes underneath, it goes outside the dome and over the top of the dome, and then it comes back down this way. So from the medieval standpoint, there's really no such thing as the sun going underneath our planet. But there are other ways, of course, to understand it, that the sun goes underneath our planet, which is discussed in Maseches Pesachim. Chazal were cognizant of that, that the earth is round. Chazal were cognizant of that, it seems like, as well. But there are many different ways to interpret this. But the bottom line is, you see that the Gemara is trying to tell us that if we observe the sun's trajectory over the course of the different seasons of the year, we'll be able to calculate what is due north and what is due south and what is due east and what is due west. Amar Rav Misharshia lesnu lahani klale. And Rav Misharshia says, I don't agree that you can adduce this from looking at the trajectory of the sun. Titania lo yatsa chama me'ola mikeren mizrachas tzfonis, v'shaka bekeren maravis tzfonis, v'lo yatsa chama mikeren mizrachas teromis, v'shaka bekeren maravis teromis. That it's simply not true that the sun ever came out from the exact northeast corner and set in the exact northwest corner of the sky, nor did it ever happen that the sun came out exactly from the southeast corner of the sky and set in the southwest corner of the sky. What I believe that Rav Misharshia is addressing is the fact that it all depends upon where on the planet you are situated. If you're in Bavel, your view of the sun is going to be one way. If you're in Eretz Yisrael, it will be another way. If you're Australia, it's going to be a completely different way. It really all depends on your proximity to the equator, and therefore, if you're not on the equator itself, the entire appearance of the sun's trajectory is going to throw you off, and you won't be able to calculate due north and south that way. That's what I believe is going on. I could be mistaken, and I could have a completely wrong understanding of this Gemara, but at least you have a working understanding. Amar Shmuel, ain't kufas nisan nofeles ela be'arba'a riv'ei hayom, o b'tchilas hayom o b'tchilas halayla, o b'chatzi hayom o b'chatzi halayla. Now, in order to understand this, you need to just do a small little calculation in your head. We're going to try and simplify it as much as possible. A year, a solar year, which is how we calculate the motion of the sun, because that's why we call it a solar year, is 365 and a quarter days. Now, if you divide that by 4 to get the 4 tekufos, to get the 4 quadrants of the year, which is winter, spring, summer, and fall, then you're going to get that every quadrant or every season is 91 days, 7 hours and a quarter. Okay? Now, keep that in mind. But before we get to the 91, 7 hours and a quarter, think about 365 and a quarter. Every year, if a year is 365 and a quarter days, that extra quarter pushes the same day of the following year a quarter of a day forward, at least as far as the time of the day when the tekufa begins. So therefore, since we're going according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that the sun was placed in its position at the beginning of Tekufas Nisan, at the beginning of the spring equinox, which is what we call Tekufas Nisan. That's when the sun was positioned in its place on the 4th day of creation. So it was put there at the beginning of the day, which is at sunset. Okay? Now, the following year, the year after creation, you'd have to fast forward the Tekufa a quarter of a day. which would mean 6 hours later, right? So therefore, that's what the Gemara means when it says that Tekufa of Nisan will always be on the 6th hour. It'll either begin at the beginning of the day, or the beginning of the night, or the middle of the day, or the middle of the night, always advancing 6 hours. So it'll be on either hour 0, hour 6, hour 12, hour 18, or back to hour 0, if we wanted to use our normal clocks, okay? Ve'ein tekufas tamuz nofelas ela o be'echas umechza o b'sheva umechza. Now remember, we advance every quadrant, every tekufa, we advance 91 days, 7¼ hours. So you're advancing 7¼ hours from tekufas Nisan, just using the remainder of how many hours? 7.5 hours. Sorry, 7½ hours, thank you. 7½ hours. So you're advancing from one tekufa to the next 7½ hours, not counting the days. So if the tekufa begins at the beginning of the evening, during tekufas Nisan, you have to push it forward 7½ hours to find out what time of the evening it'll be during tekufas Tammuz. Okay? So therefore, it'll be either 1½ hours or 7½ hours into the night or into the day, based upon that calculus. Because if you do it 7½ hours, so let's say you're talking about hour 0, which is the beginning of the night, so then 7½ hours later will be 7½ hours into the night. Or, if Tekufas Nisan is in hour 6, so then Tekufas Tammuz will be hour 13½, which will be 1½ hours into the following segment. Okay? And then it keeps on going that way.
If the Tekufa of Nisan, which is the equinox, is 6 hours, every 6 hours for 24 hours, those are Shos Manios? And then
well, Shos Manios are always 1 hour at the equinox. Oh.
Right. But then when we go to
the solstice. Yeah, no, we're dealing. You're right. You're right. You're right. Right. For the purposes of our discussion, we're dealing with 60-minute hours for the purposes of our discussion. Okay.
Glad we clarified.
Okay. Ve'ein bayom uve'ein balayla. Okay. Ve'ein tekufas tishrei nofeles ela b'shalosh sha'os o b'seisha sha'os. Now let's advance that further. 7½ hours plus 7½ hours will take us to the next tekufa, which will be tekufas tishrei. That's always going to be 15 hours after tekufas Nisan. So if tekufas Nisan falls out in hour 0, the beginning of the night, so then it'll be an hour 15, which will be 3 hours into the next segment to the next, into the daytime. If Nisan falls out at hour 6, then this will come out at hour 18, which turns out to be hour 9. I'm sorry. Obeseisha shows. No, B'shalosh shows. Obeseisha shows.
15?
Sorry. 6 plus 15 is 21, which turns out to be hour 9 into the day, because it's 12 plus 9, right? So anyway, you do the math, it works out this way. Bein b'yom uvein b'layla. Bein tekufas teves nofelas ela o ba'arba umechza o ba'eser umechza bein b'yom uvein b'layla. And when you get to tekufas teves, you add another 7½ hours, so it's 15 plus 7½, which is 22½. So it's basically 22½ beyond what the beginning of tekufas Nisan is. And that'll turn out to be either 4½ or 10½ hours into the day or into the night. Okay? So the math works out. It's very sound math. Just telling you when you can anticipate what hour the beginning of the new tekufa will be. And the distance between one tekufa and another is exactly 91 days, 7½ hours. The last statement that that Shmuel makes, Shmuel was an expert in astronomy, is that, and this really requires a knowledge of something which is very foreign to us, and therefore I certainly don't have a good grasp of an understanding of it, but the Gemara talks about the signs of the zodiac. There are 7 signs of the planetary zodiac, not the stellar zodiac, but the planetary zodiac, there are 7 different planetary shifts. Every 7 hours, you return back to the original. So the order of the planetary shifts is is as follows. It's first is Kochav, which is Mercury, then Levana, which is Moon, then Shabtai, which is Saturn, then Tzedek, which is Jupiter, then Madim, which is Mars, and then Chama, which is Sun, and then Noga, which is Venus. Okay, so you get those 7. Every hour of the day is dominated by another one of these 7 planets. After 7 hours, it starts all over again, the cycle. And so if you want to know the beginning of the new Tekufa, which planet is it dominated by, it just advances a half an hour with every Tekufa. So if the Tekufas Nisan was the beginning of the Tekufa of Mercury, so then the next Tekufa will be a half an hour into the Tekufa, or into the planet of Mercury, and the next Tekufa will be the beginning of Levana, will be the beginning of Moon. The next one will be a half an hour into the Moon. The next one will be the planet of Shabtai, which will be Saturn, okay, and so forth and so on. So that also requires a mathematical calculus, which you can do with pen and paper. As you'll see, just work it. It works out. If you do every 7 hours, there's a new shift. Then after 91 days, 7.5 hours, it works out, because since the remainder is 7.5 hours, you basically are advancing 7.5 hours with each tekufa. And since the tekufa renews itself every 7 hours, you're only left with a remainder of a half an hour. Okay, V'amar Shmuel. Shmuel further said, Ein lecha tekufas Nisan shenofeles b'tzedek she'ena mishaberes es ha'ilanos, ve'ein lecha tekufas Teves shenofeles b'tzedek she'ena miyabeshes es hazro'im. Furthermore, he said that if tekufas Nisan falls out under the planet of Tzedek, of Jupiter, then you know that the weather will be inclement, so much so that the trees will break. And if tekufas Teves falls out under the planet of Jupiter, then the seeds will dry out because of the winds. And v'hu de'isyulid levana, o b'levana, o b'tzedek. Provided, however, and this is the first time that we're seeing a coinciding of 2 different systems, the solar system and the lunar system, that's provided that when will the weather be so windy like that? When not only does the beginning of the Tekufa fall under the planet of Jupiter, but also that the moilad of Nisan takes place. In other words, basically the new phase of the moon of Rosh Chodesh Nisan takes place under the planet of Levana, of Moon, the Moon planet, or the Jupiter planet. Okay? And when I say the word planet, obviously we know the Moon technically is a satellite and not a planet, but that's for our modern terminology. From Chazal's terminology, the sun is a planet, the moon is a planet. They're just a celestial body other than stars. Okay, we are going to continue. So hold on to your questions. Okay, Tanu Rabbana. Unless it's something that you really need to understand the Gemara with.
No.
Okay, Tanu Rabbana. Now that we've done the easy part, let's go on to geometry. We've finished our astronomy class for today. Let's go on to geometry.
Now I understand how our boys learn the secular subjects.
That's right. Yeah, there you go. Tanu Rabbana. They don't learn these Gemaras in high school. I guarantee it. Nor in base medrash. Tanu Rabbanan. Hamirabeya es ha'ir. Maybe some in the base medrash. Tanu Rabbanan. Hamirabeya es ha'ir. Osa kimin tavla miruba'as. V'chozer umirabeya es hatchumin v'osa osan kimin tavla miruba'as. Did someone give me paper like I asked for, or did you guys ignore my request?
There's paper here.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to do, Mark, we're going to do a number of diagrams today, and so I'd like to ask if you wouldn't mind to, I know that my face is extremely photogenic, and that's why people tune into these shiurim, but for today, I'm going to ask you to focus on this space where I'm going to be making diagrams, okay? So do you mind doing the camera work for us?
All right.
You tell me when you're ready, okay?
Okay.
Okay, good?
Yeah.
All right, and we're still rolling, right? Okay, so all the Brisa has said so far is very simply that when you have a city, let's imagine that the city is circular, you first have to square off the city as follows, and then you make another square, kimin tavla, basically like a square tray, around that, which is 2,000 amas in all directions. Okay? That's essentially all the Brisa has said so far. Okay? That's really that's all we're saying. Ucheshehu moded lo yimdod me'emtza hakeren alpayim ama mipnei shehu mafsidis hazavuyos. And when you want to measure the 2,000 amas, anyone who'd like to come closer and just watch as I'm drawing, you're more than welcome to. When you measure the 2,000 amos from the edge of the city to the edge of the tchum, you don't measure from the corner. Because by measuring from the corner, you're measuring 2,000 of a hypotenuse, you're going to end up shortchanging your 2,000 amas in the normal directions that are not the corners. Because as we know, the hypotenuse is much longer than the right angle sides of the triangle. So instead of measuring the corners, you're going to end up measuring 2,000 from the sides that are not at the corner. And that's all the Brisa has told us now as well. If you were to measure 2,000 amas from the corner, you'd end up with only about 1,400 amas length from the flat sides. Okay, Elamevi tabla meruba she alpayim ama omenicha bekeren ba'al chesona nimtze sa'ir mistakeres arba meos ama lekan va'arba meos amos lekan nimsu tchumen mistakrin ches meos amos lekan ushmona meos lekan. So the Brisa therefore says that really what you should do is, and here in order to understand the language of the Brisa, we're using an example of where the city's diameter is exactly 2,000 amas. And therefore, when you're going to square it off, you're going to imagine taking a square that is 2,000 amas by 2,000 amas, the square that you're bounding the city, the circular city with, that has a diameter of 2,000 amas. And then you're going to add another larger square outside of that, which is going to bound it by 2,000 amas on all of the flat sides. And therefore explains the Brisa that by squaring off the city with the smaller square around the circle of the city, you end up getting a corner over here of an extra length of 400 amas. All right? Basically because when you have a right angle triangle where each side is 1, the hypotenuse is 1.4. So that's going to add, if you multiply that, add a few zeros to that, since the radius of this city is 1,000 amas because it's a 2,000 amma diameter, so if from the center of the city the radius is 1,000, so then you're going to end up with another 400 amas adding to the corner.
From the perimeter to the corner.
From the midpoint to the corner, you'll end up with 1,400 amas.
Right.
From the perimeter of the circle to the corner will be 400. You'll also end up getting 800 extra amas from the corner of the inner square to the corner of the outer square, meaning you'll get 2,800 amas because the you multiply basically 1,000. In other words, it's proportional. Just like if you have 1,000 amas on your right angles, the hypotenuse is 1,400. If you have 2,000, the hypotenuse will be 2,800. So therefore, it turns out. So therefore, explains the Brisa that nimtzu tchumen mistakrin ches meos ama lekan shmona lekan nimtzu ha'ir tchumen mistakrin elafu masayim lekan ve'elafu masayim lekan. So it turns out that when you want to calculate the total added distance that you get by squaring off the city, you end up with a total of 1,200, because you get the 400 from the perimeter of the circle to the inner corner, to the corner of the smaller square, plus you get an extra 800 from on the hypotenuse of the outer tchum. So you've added 1,200 additional amas that you have to your corner. Amar Abaye, umishkach hasla b'masa dehavya trei alfei atrei alfei. This math works because we're dealing with a city whose diameter is 2,000, which means that when you square it off, you have a square of 2,000 by 2,000. Okay, fine. Tanya. That was the easy part. No. We got much more. This was the easy part. Tanya, Amar Rebbe Eliezer beRebbe Yossi, Tchum Arei Leviim Alpayim Amma. Now, we know that there's something called the Arei HaLeviim. The Arei HaLeviim are the Levite cities. We've learned about them before. That's where we get our source text for knowing that you expand the boundary beyond the city by 2,000 amas. Now, if you recall, we had said that it's 1,000 plus 1,000. It's 1,000 of migrash, and it's 1,000 of sadeh. Migrash is the area that's just flat land, that nothing is growing. That's the first 1,000 amas of the perimeter around the city. Then the second 1,000 amas around the city is sadeh, which is field that is used for grazing for your animals and for planting of agriculture. Okay? That's the way the Torah describes the construction, the engineering of the Levite cities. Now, when we want to think about it, he says, Tchum Arei Levim Alpayim Amma. So the first boundary, or the first 1,000 amas, is going to be 1,000 amas outside the perimeter of the city. Sei mehem elef amma migrash. It's 2,000 amas. You subtract the 1,000 amas, which is the first 1,000 amas of the migrash, of the flat land. Nimsa migrash ravia b'hasha'ar sados ucheramim. It turns out that the migrash area is a quarter, and the rest is sada, the rest is field. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all. That makes absolutely no sense at all. You can think about it intuitively, that the size of the migrash should, if it's 1,000 amas, the first 1,000 amas is migrash, the second 1,000 amas is sadeh, it should really be about more like half and half, not a quarter and three quarters. So we're going to have to do the math and work this out. So first of all, minahani mili. First of all, how do you know that the first 1,000 amas is migrash and the second 1,000 amas is sadeh? Because Amar Rava to Amar Kra, mikir ha'ir v'chutza elef amas aviv. That from the perimeter of the city, 1,000 amas all around shall be migrash. Amar Torah saveves ha'ir be'elef. So the Torah says, surround the city's perimeter by 1,000 amas with migrash. Nimsa migrash ravia. So it turns out that the migrash is a quarter. So the Gemara says, ravia? Palgahabi. What do you mean it's a quarter? It's a half. Amar Rava bar Ada mishalcha'a. Amar Rava bar Ada mishalcha'a aspirali. Rava explains that bar Ada, the measurer, the guy who would go out with the measuring tape, he explained it to me. Mishkachas la b'masa dehavya trei alfi a trei alfe. So let's go back to our example. We have a city. The diameter of the city is 2,000 from one end of the city to another. We square it off. So therefore, the square of the city, each side of the square is 2,000 amas. Tchum kamahavya shitzer. Karnos kamahavyan shitzer. Now, in order to understand the way that the math is being used, what you do is you divide everything in the city into 1,000 amma by 1,000 amma squares. So therefore, as hopefully we're getting this on camera, we take a city that's 2,000 amas in diameter and divide it into 4 squares. Each square is 1,000 by 1,000. Is that clear? Now we're going to do the same in delineating the boundaries all around. If we're going to create a perimeter of 1,000 amas for migrash, we're going to do it like that. And then we're going to create another perimeter of 1,000 amas for sadeh. We're going to do it like that. But wait a minute. We got to create 1,000 by 1,000 amas squares. So we're going to go like this. 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 Okay, but that's not all. Then we got to go like this, and like this, and like this, and like this, and like this, 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 and this. Okay, now, what part of this is our migrash? We're going to shade our migrash. So this is our migrash. How many squares did you count?
8.
Sorry, count again.
4, 12.
You should have been looking at my diagram. How many squares?
12.
4,
12. You have 12 squares of migrash, okay? How many squares of sada do you have?
8, 20.
You got 20 squares of sada, okay? Now, as we all know, when you add 12 and 20 together, what do you get?
32.
32, and 12 is a quarter of 32, as we all know, right?
Oh, you go on the outside.
On the outside side.
So the Gemara is going to ask this question. So let's take a look at this. So, first of all, the Gemara says you have 16 squares when you forget about the corners. You have 4 squares here from both migrash and sada. 4 squares here of migrash and sada. 4 squares here, 4 squares here. That's a total of 16. Then you had another 16 squares for the corners over here. So you have a total of 32 squares outside the entire city. So, therefore, the Gemara then says, Dal temanya de techumin ve'arba de kranos. Now let's take a look only at the squares of the migrash. So we've got 8 of the non-corner parts, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the migrash. And ve'arba de kranos, take the 4 corners, 1, 2, 3, 4. Kamahavi tresa. Then you have 12 squares of the migrash. Nimsa migrash ravi. So the Gemara says it turns out that the migrash, which is 12, is a quarter of 32 squares. The Gemara says tfei mitlasan inhu. What are you talking about? 12 is more than a third of 32. It's not only more than a quarter, it's more than a third of 32. The Gemara answers, I see arba'a demasa shadi alayhu. But take the 4 squares of the city itself to get a total of 36 squares, and 12 is a quarter of 36, as we all know.
48.
So the Gemara then says, what are you talking about? Akati tilsahavi. That's not a quarter, that's a third. 12 is a third of 36. Even when you take into account the squares of the city itself, and you combine them with all of the squares, 12 is still only a third of 12 is a third of 36, not a quarter. The Gemara says, "Mi savras biribua ka'amar bi'igula ka'amar." Answers the Gemara. We got the camera focused. You didn't understand. The migrash is not in a square configuration. The migrash is in a circle configuration, just like this. This is the migrash. The migrash is like this, okay? And so this is our migrash. Now, you lose the corners of the migrash. Now, what's the difference between the area of a circle versus the area of a square? So the Gemara says, Kama meruba yeser al ha'agul. What is the difference between the area of a square that bounds the circle that's inside of it? Ravia, it's 25% larger. So when you subtract 25% from the 12 squares of the migrash, what do you get? Dal Ravia minayo pashaluhu tisha. You get 9. 20. You get.
Oh no.
You get 9. Take a quarter away from 12, and you get 9. So therefore, v'tisha mitlasin v'shisa rivahavi, and therefore 9 is a quarter of 36, and that's how we get the math. Okay, fantastic. Let's go on to our next diagram, and then we'll be done for the day. Abaya Amar Mishkachas Lanami b'masa dahavya alpha ba'alpha tchumen. That math was done for a city that was 2,000 by 2,000. But the math will also work just even more elegantly if we take a city that's 1,000 by 1,000. So let's just draw our city. Okay, we have our circular city that's bounded by its square, and the diameter is 1,000. Okay, now let's draw our diagrams. Now that the city is 1,000, so we're going to have 1,000 of migrash all around, right? And then we're going to have our additional 1,000 of sadeh all around. Yeah, boy, I must have been missing that day. Okay, now, Harold, you flunked the last exam. We're going to ask you, how large is the migrash now?
8.
How many squares, how many thousand amma by
8,
thousand amma
8,
squares
8.
is the migrash? Okay, it's 8. It's 8 squares, okay? So let's take a look at it. So Abaya says, Mishkachas lami baslavi alpha balfa tchumen kama havu tamanya kranos. So I'm sorry, tchumen kama havu tamanya. So you're going to have, first of all, when you measure the number of squares that go off of the sides, you get 2, 2, 2, and 2. Counting both the migrash and the sada, that's 8. Kronos kamahavi shitsar, then you take the 4 of the corners, 4 on each corner. That's an additional 16. So you have a total of how many squares going around? 24. Got 24 squares total. Dal arba de techumin, the arba de kronos. Take away from the migrash, you've got 4 squares of the flat sides of the migrash, 4 of the corners. So you got 8 squares that are going to be the migrash. So kama havi tamanya. So therefore, as we all know, 8 is a quarter of 24. Is 8 a quarter of 24? No, 8 is a third of 24. That's the Gemara's question. Til sahavu. That's only a third. So the Gemara says, Mi savras biribua kamar bi'igula kamar. Once again, we take into account the fact that the migrash is a circular boundary that goes, a boundary that goes around the city, not square. So therefore, and we know that the area of a circle that is bounded by a square is going to be 1/4 smaller than the area of the square that bounds it. And so therefore, kama meruba yeser al ha'agul revia, dal revia pashtalahu shisa, vishisa michaf dalad riva havi. So therefore, take 3/4 of 8, and what do you get? 6. So it's not 8, but rather it's going to be a total of 6 squares of 1,000 by 1,000, and we know that 6 taka is a quarter of 24. And therefore, we don't have to come up with taking into account the area of the city and using these calculations. It's a much more elegant method of calculating, and therefore you see that that's why we get that the migrash is a quarter of the total area of the 2,000 by 2,000 square that's around the city. You have a wonderful Shabbos.
You don't square a migrash.